conference. We're currently on pause, but it's a fantastic conference. It's unconference style. It's kept very small as well. It's where I met Raven, actually, who spoke before. And it's really about bringing people together, fostering community around REST APIs or other web architecture concerns. I also have done a lot of community building and organizing with Code for Denver when I lived in Denver, on civic technology projects, working with community organizations to improve communities through technology. And more recently, I've worked at the US Digital Service, working with agencies such as the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services on healthcare APIs, as well as the CDC, and on environmental justice. And currently, I'm a fellow at the Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation, where I work with state and local governments to improve software collaboration across jurisdictions. So helping states and local governments collaborate to build or buy software together instead of going it alone. And I also have a civic technology blog called Civic Unrest, where I talk about public digital infrastructure. Today, I'm going to talk about what is a community of practice, what is an API community of practice, why you might want one, and how to do one in 5 steps. So, what's a community of practice? Essentially, it's a group of people who share a concern or a passion for something that they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. So obviously, concern or passion, it's people who share something, an interest. But an important part about this is that it's something that they do. The practice part is a key component. They have to be practitioners. And there's also this core learning component. It's about sharing knowledge, learning to do something better together through interaction. So through communication, through being together, not just through reading about something online. And what is an API community of practice? Well, at risk of being too obvious, essentially it's a group of people who do this, who are practicing the design, building, or use of APIs and learning how to do that better as they interact regularly. And I think I want to just call out use of APIs specifically. I think it's super important as we're developing communities and as we're doing anything regarding APIs, we're not just talking to the people who are on the build side, but we're also including the people who are using the APIs, even if they consider themselves front-end developers or mobile developers, what have you. Bringing people together on both ends is critical, I think, for building a shared understanding and a shared language. So why might you want to make one? Well, APIs are all about machine readability. It's about getting machines to talk to each other. But for those of us who have been building and designing APIs, we know that really we're building for the people behind the machines. And how can we help machines talk to each other if we as people are not talking to each other? And I'm curious, actually, for folks in the room, how many people work at a large-ish organization that has more than one API team? Cool, okay, about halvesies. Do y'all have a community of practice for APIs? Oh, awesome, cool, that's great. I'm curious also, maybe for people who are not in that situation, but for everybody in the room, how many folks are trying to implement API standards or best practices across your organization? Okay, a few. Awesome. Well, I think that communities of practice are a really fantastic way, not just to build community with an organization and to help people learn from each other, feel greater connections, and have fun and be happier together at work, but they're also a great opportunity to help share best practices and really create a culture around the API standards that you're trying to create. Create a shared language, shared vocabulary, and get people using the same tools, the same approaches, and knowing how to talk to each other about them. Let's see. This is where my notes might also come in handy. Because really also, people are your greatest resource. I think we all talk about this, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that and to put it into practice through communities of practice and investing in people. And people are more important than the machines. I'm also not a graphic designer, if you can't tell. These people look like they're maybe dancing and stomping on top of the machines, which is maybe a goal we all want anyway. So how do we actually get to a community of practice? First, I'm going to give a little bit of context about a recent situation that I was in. So as I said, I've been doing community building in a wide variety of contexts. I currently lead a community of practice for government practitioners. government technologists. But when I first started working at the US Digital Service back in 2019, I started working with Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So I'm going to back up for a second and talk about the US Digital Service. This is an agency that's within the White House, but we often work with other federal agencies to do technology projects. So that might be modernization projects. I've done a number of those in my time there, but it's also greenfield product development, so maybe experimenting with a new design or a prototype and bringing that to market. It could also just be firefighting and doing incident resolution, which I've also done there as well. But when I first started at US Digital Service, I was placed in the team at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. This is the agency that manages all of the money around Medicare and Medicaid implementation, as well as the rules and regulations and support for states as they implement those, Medicaid specifically, and for the federal government as they implement Medicare. So it's a huge organization, actually. It's 10,000 people. There's a mix of federal staff, full-time employees, and contractors. Within that, there's lots of teams, and interestingly, there's no central API strategy, even though there are dozens of APIs, both internal and external. And when I first started working at CMS, I was on an API product, called Data at the Point of Care. Encourage folks to look that up. It's a really awesome product that helps get Medicare claims data in the hands of providers to give doctors a fuller picture of their patient's health, because often Medicare claims records is the most comprehensive list of the treatments, prescriptions, et cetera, that a patient might be on. And as I was working on this, it's a Fire-based API. I wanted to learn what other products were out there, what other APIs CMS was building, if we were building this API in a kind of standard way. And as I started doing my research and talking to more and more people, what I found was that there was this huge variety of APIs at the organization. There was no centralization. One notable practice was that everybody had their own authentication strategy. So even if you did have public APIs, if somebody wanted to use more than one, they'd actually have to authenticate in completely different ways to those different APIs, which is a terrible user experience. And there were also a wide variety of technical specifications around the APIs that were file-based, EDI, SOAP, REST, GraphQL. I think some people were even starting to do gRPC. Huge variety. And something I also saw was that not many people were aware of each other, not many people were talking to each other. So there was a huge opportunity, both for me to learn more about what was happening, and also to help try to set in place some API practices that teams could really learn from, and ultimately help better outcomes for the API products that existed, and help the user experience of these APIs. So the first thing I did, as I said, was I started to go talk to people. I had to do a lot of kind of investigative discovery work to figure out where these APIs were. Along the way, I kind of wrote a report recommending that we create an API catalog across the organization so we could start to keep track and even know who owned what APIs and how to talk to them, where the documentation was. But really, as I was talking to people, what I was really doing was I was starting to listen to people. This is also going to be my first cute animal slide of the day. There will be more, don't worry. But listening to people is the really important part. And I think that's something that we can forget as hardcore API enthusiasts, especially if you have your API flavor that you love, like GraphQL, or maybe you're just a total Restafarian, like I am. But when you go talk to people, it's really important that you don't start pushing your ideas and practices on them at the outset. You have to really understand their business context, what problems they're trying to solve with their API, what constraints that they live in that maybe inform why they've made some of the decisions that they've made about their design. And one note, too, about CMS is that a lot of those APIs were started organically. And if you're in a big enterprise, you're probably familiar with that as well. Some of them are very organic. Some of them were intentionally designed as products. And it's really important to understand how these APIs got started, what problems they're solving, who the users are, and who are the people who are building them, and why are they building them. And it's also important to do this as user research for your community of practice. You can start to understand where people are feeling what they're missing in the organization. Do they really lack opportunities to connect with other folks? Do they really yearn for in-person things as opposed to virtual things? Go find out. Go find out what is really missing from their community. What I found out at CMS was that not only were people, feeling clueless about what was happening at the enterprise or across the enterprise, but I also found out that people wanted standards, which I was kind of surprised by, because I'm also used to developers who are like, don't tell me what to do. But people really wanted standards, they wanted conventions, they wanted best practices, because they wanted their jobs to be easier, and having to make this stuff up as they go along and kind of reinvent the wheel was really difficult. And it just wasn't very efficient. They just wanted a blueprint that they could implement and then worry about the harder problems. Oh, awesome, thank you for the notes. This is a mountain viscacha, by the way, super cute. All right, so the next step, building on this, is it's not just about you listening, it's about helping other people listen. And what I mean by this is that you, as a community of practice convener, have to be a catalyst for connection. You have to give opportunities, give people opportunities to listen. That could be you have a conversation with somebody, you hear that they're having a problem, and you maybe have had another conversation recently with somebody who's actually solved that problem already. And you just make that connection. Send an email intro, invite them both to coffee, however you want to do that. But as you start to become aware of what's happening across your community, you need to be proactive about helping people form connections and meet each other outside of whatever big events you might be engaging. Because really, you're helping people start to talk to each other, start to learn from each other, and ultimately you're helping people become resources for each other. These are spotted hyenas. And it's really important that people become resources for each other because you're one person. It doesn't really matter if you're an executive and you're in a very visible position of leadership, you're still only one person. You can't be in every conversation. And if you really want to scale out cultural change across the agency, you have to teach people how to be ambassadors of that change. You have to help them be the change that you want to see. All right, third, create inclusive spaces. This is really important, and inclusive is not just a buzzword. It's incredibly important, not just thinking about it's like safety and codes of conduct, although definitely when I have big events or have open source projects, they all have codes of conduct. And it's not just talking about making sure that diverse voices are represented. You should definitely be doing that. But also from an API and kind of team perspective, making sure that you're including both the business and the technical side in your conversations, that you're including both the users and the builders. It's also about making sure that you do have accessible presentations. For example, if you're doing things virtual, you can enable live transcripts now quite easily from most tools, which I really recommend. And furthermore, it's kind of at a baseline, really creating community norms so that people all have an understanding when they come into the space that you're creating, the expectations around how will we interact with each other in the space, how will we do that respectfully, how will we do that in a way that everybody feels like they're supposed to be there. I usually start with 3 key norms that I encourage folks to use, but you can also add on them or modify them as you see fit. One of those is I ask people to be present. My favorite phrase is, why be here if you're not going to be here? So I start that kind of with every sort of meeting or conversation with that. My second norm that I use is to make space and take space. So really trying to encourage folks to create those spaces themselves and recognize if somebody else in the room has been trying to speak and make space for that person to join in, but to also help people feel supported and empowered in taking up space themselves, which is especially critical for the more introverted folks who maybe don't feel comfortable in a verbal conversation. So I encourage you to find other ways to interact as well, so it doesn't have to all be in-person meetings or verbal conversations. Have asynchronous methods. If folks in the virtual meeting space have ever used GatherTown, it's awesome. Really recommend that as a way to kind of replicate an in-person environment that's also fun. So there's so many good tools. I can talk more about the tools later if folks have questions. But kind of on the flip side of this, I think it's really important to have people be involved in the co-creation of these inclusive spaces. Help people take ownership of the community, make them feel like they have a part in it and like they are influencing it, which will make them just so much more engaged with the community itself and to be more engaged with the content from learning for each other. So what does this actually look like? It could be having opportunities for people to influence the community norms or values. So starting maybe with the base set, like I just kind of listed, but giving people the chance to say, like, this, this other value is really important to me, proposing it to the group and adding it in. But it also means helping to empower people create conversations themselves. So if somebody has an idea for a community event, or they have a question for the group, but don't feel comfortable asking it, helping them feel safe and comfortable asking that question, starting that conversation on your Discord or your Slack or your Google group, and giving them the tools to do that inclusively. This is a kinkajou. All right, fourth step, curate content intentionally. It is so important if you are creating spaces where somebody is presenting, like at a conference or even in just monthly meetings, that you are doing the work to make sure that that content is good. Don't just hope that people bring good content. You really have to work with them to make sure that they are telling a good story, that they are basing their content in actual experience instead of hypotheticals, and that they're bringing something that's relevant for the group. And that also involves doing some brainstorming with them. It involves you going out into the community to find those stories that maybe people don't realize they have. So this is work. If it's not clear, creating a community of practice is work. At CMS, we have an API summit. And with that summit, even though it's entirely internal, we have a call for presenters process that includes tips on how to make a good story, how to make a good presentation. And we also had requirements that the presentation be based in real experience. It couldn't be hypotheticals. It couldn't just be about the buzzwords. And it also couldn't be a sales pitch. In government, you're constantly working with contractors, and sometimes they just want to try to sell you more stuff. We don't want that. But we do want contractors to be part of the conversation and part of that inclusive community. All right, so on the flip side of this one, we have a cute Pika, who's really good at marketing. And really, you have to create that content on the input side, but you also have to make sure people know why that content is relevant to them. So do that marketing intentionally, too. It's not always obvious why a story about logs for your APIs is relevant for other parts of the organization. But people need to know why they are taking time out of their busy day to come to your meetings, to come to your community events. Then you know why it's valuable, what they'll get out of it. And I think it's also really important if you're bringing in both the business and the technical side on the API space to be a bit more proactive about doing that translation work between the two, because they might be two sides of the org that don't really talk to each other that much or have totally different languages, and doing that translation to help create the shared language between those two sides is really important and part of making content relevant. And lastly, it's really important to show institutional support. I personally am a kind of an ask for forgiveness, not permission sort of person, but a lot of people are not. And even if folks don't need permission to participate in something, they do still benefit from having encouragement to participate. It's really important that everybody feels and knows and feels confident that the leadership cares about the community effort and the initiative, and that gives them permission to take time out of their busy day to block off time for the monthly meetings and events, or even contribute to a community project. Or maybe even feel like it's a good thing if they raise their hand to share their story at a brown bag or a training or some other event. But it's not just about showing institutional support. It's not just about lip service. You really have to enact institutional support for community building initiatives at your organization. I have seen so many communities of practice and been part of ones that really just depend on one person who has that drive, that energy, and just cares about community building. Before I was at CMS, there was actually somebody else who had started a community of practice around APIs, but he had left 6 months to a year before me, and it had just been totally stagnant. And he had just done it because he felt like it was important as well. I came in, kind of discovered this during my discovery process of talking to people, tried to build on some of what was left over. But if I hadn't come along, it might have been totally dead. And after I left, one of my big concerns was making sure that it would live past me. And a big part of that is having structure and institutional support that is not just lip service to actually maintaining the community. Ways that you could do that, you could set up rotating leadership of your community of practice. So maybe have kind of a rotating committee of people where for the first 3 to 6 months you have one person facilitating, and then it transitions to another volunteer, and that way it's never too much burden on one person. It's never seen as like a long-term commitment, but does give somebody the time and opportunity to maybe try out new skills, such as community facilitation, or to focus on something that they care about. But also, ultimately, I just think you should make it somebody's job. Even these kind of rotating volunteer structures can die out, especially if the organization is hitting some bumps or everybody goes on summer vacation. It can be really hard to keep up momentum, and that's super critical for a community initiative, is doing that kind of plumbing work. And as API people, we care about the plumbing, and the people side, you should care about that too. And these are bush dogs. All right, so that is it from me. You can follow me on Twitter at Switzerly. Feel free to connect with me there. You can check out my blog, civicunrest.com. You can also check out my current work working with governments at softwarecollaborative.org. And if you're interested in this kind of US digital service model of working with governments on their APIs, there's so much opportunity for APIs and digital data infrastructure within government. Check out usds.gov. Also, agencies have their own opportunities within them, and I'm happy to take any questions about that too.
We have time. Wow, that's okay. We have 2 minutes, but let's try.
My question is, all the time when you have to do a community of practice or when you have to get buy-in, because number 5 is institutional support, how do you deal with the you have to have a culture for that in order for you to have the institutional support. So if that's a challenge, how do you bypass that?
Yeah, good question. So how do you convince leadership or change the culture enough to support community initiatives? It's really hard, but I think part of it is showing the value of doing it. So, I would get something started, see how it works. I think if people are, if you're listening to people and responding and creating good content that people care about, then the whole organization will be talking about it. Like, people will always be talking about what they've learned from such and such event. They'll make connections, and you can bring all that back. You can also do surveys. Like, after events, I usually send out surveys asking for feedback, but that's also good data that you can use to show leadership that this sort of thing is really important. And especially if you can start to tie it into more probably established things that your organization already has, like training, or some organizations already have some amount of employee resource group kind of things. If you can start to tie it into those, then you might find it easier to get support.
And if you cover this, I apologize. I got here a little late, but community practice is great for sharing knowledge between teams, so you don't end up with 3 ways of authenticating APIs like you alluded to. But you also have a central governance team, COE or whatever, Center for Enablement, that can be a little ivory tower. And is there a role for the community of practice to be a feedback loop so that they can adjust their guidance and governance that doesn't work and always keep that grounded in reality?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. And actually, that was something I missed talking about. But it's really important as you're trying to create standards for your organization that you are listening to the people who have been doing the APIs at your organization for a long time. Even if you don't necessarily agree with how they're doing them, it's super important to figure out what have they really learned with their users and with the tech that's currently available and with the institution that you have, the culture that you have, and how can that then shape your standards? You should definitely not just be pontificating your own vocabulary or your own way of doing things without getting that buy-in and learning from the people who are on the ground. Otherwise, you'll feel out of touch, and people will just be grumbling about it. You won't have buy-in from the teams. It'll be so much harder. So doing the active work of listening and having that two-way communication. And notably, at CMS, there wasn't the sort of centralized governing structure. That part of this was trying to fill that gap, actually, by creating a grassroots kind of governing structure. So what we did was we actually, during our API summit, had birds of a feather breakouts for different parts of our API lifecycle and business units, and then created best practices together that were then put in Confluence and could be shaped over time. But if you have a central authority, definitely making sure that you're taking that community feedback is critical, I think, for good practices anyway, but definitely also for getting people to use them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shelby. Thank you for presenting that. Yeah, thank you.